All right, welcome to part 2 of Introduction to Unity Scripts. I split these into 2 videos. First one was getting kind of long. There's a lot of information to go over, and I could move faster and I could do all this in a very short period of time, but I would like to go over through and explain, since this is an introduction. In later videos, I will be going a lot faster through putting some of this together, but for people who are just starting out, there's a lot to absorb, so I want to take my time. So what I want to do now is, instead of just creating that arrow and having it move, I want to allow the user to choose when and how those items are created. So what I need to do is I need to allow the user to move a controller. What I'm calling a controller is some type of controller object. And just for simplicity, I'm going to use my little yellow cube for that controller object. So what we need to do is we need to have a script to do that. Now what I did is I renamed my script that I had called create arrow because I don't need it anymore. What I want to do is I want to create these arrows using this controller. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go into my script. I have it up here already. And I'm going to add something to it. I'm going to rename this my arrow object, because really I could add any type of projectile. I'll call it a projectile, something I'm going to make and I'm going to move. And so I'm going to call this my projectile object. Let's get that Y back in there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another serialized field. Again, I'm going to copy and paste just so I don't have to type all that again. And I'm going to call this one my controller object. I'm using object in the name, again, to specify this as this is a game object. There's lots of other types that I can set from the Unity interface. So this controller object is going to be what I'm going to want to move with my mouse. So what I do is I don't need this anymore. So I'm going to be getting rid of this. And I'm going to be adding a line of code that gets mouse input from the user. I want to use my mouse in order to move my controller back and forth. So I'm going to type input, which is gets mouse or keyboard input from the user. Lots of different ways of getting this. What I'm going to use is I'm going to use the mouse position. I want to get my mouse position, but I want to know how the user has moved the mouse since I last checked its mouse position. I don't want to use the absolute mouse position. What I want to do is I want to use the difference between their last position and their current position. You'll see this red underline here. The red underline indicates that there's an error in my code. The reason is because I renamed that my arrow object, so now this doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to replace that. Oops, actually, you know what? I don't even need this because I'm not creating an arrow object initially. What I am creating though is my controller object. So I need to make my controller object. My yellow cube is going to appear, and that's what I'm going to move with my mouse. So instead of my arrow object, I'm going to make this my controller object. I'm going to make my controller object equal to that instantiation, and that is going to be basically at the bottom, what I'm calling the bottom of my plane. So that's correct. It's in the correct spot. And now what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make another variable here, and I'm going to want it to record the old mouse X position. So I'm going to make a float. So float is a variable which is basically a non-integer variable. So a number that can have decimals in it. An integer cannot have any decimal points. All my positions and all my locations on the screen are always floats. So I'm going to make a float, and I'm going to call it old mouse X. And when I first start out, I want to save wherever the mouse position currently is. I have no idea where it is. I have no idea where the user has put it. So I'm going to save that. And I'm going to make old mouse X equal to input. Oops, forgot to hit. Mouse position, and I just want the X component of that. So now I've saved that. And now what I want to do is I want to make another variable here. Let's call it current. Let's call it actually delta X, because it's going to be the amount that they moved, not an absolute position, but the amount that they moved. And I want to make delta X equal to the current mouse position X. And I want to subtract the old mouse position X. So that will give the amount that they moved since I last checked. And now I'm going to update old mouse X equal to input dot mouse position dot X. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to move my controller object by this amount. So I'm going to go underscore controller object dot transform dot position dot. Now I can't change the X directly. It's a read only. I have to set a whole new position. So I'm going to use that plus equals that I tried to use before, because now it's just the change in X position. And I'm going to make a new vector 3 delta X comma 0 comma 0. Now the problem is I really don't know how sensitive the user's mouse is, and a lot of games let you basically set the sensitivity of how much maybe your mouse is moving and how it's going to affect the screen. I'll just leave it here for now. Now the problem is I don't want that yellow box to be able to go off my plane. I want it to stop at the left-hand edge of my plane and stop at the right-hand edge of my plane. And if you'll remember, our plane goes from -50 to +50. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if, in fact, what I should do, I'm going to say, again, lots of different ways of doing this. Dot transform dot position dot X is either less than -50. If it's less than -50, what I want to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this so I don't have to type it all again. I want to make my position equal to new vector 3 -50 comma 0 comma 0. So basically, if it's less than that, if it's going to go off the left-hand edge, I would just want to make it equal to the left-hand edge. And I want to do the same thing for the right-hand edge. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to come here. I'm going to paste. And I'm going to say if it's greater than 50, I'm going to want to make it equal to 50. All right. Mouse X. Okay, that all looks correct. Let's try it out. Let's come in here. Again, a lot of this requires trial and error, which is why it's hard to do this in a timely manner, but hopefully this will work. Oops, I already have bugs. Oops, because I have not set my controller type. All right, so let's go to our controller. I need two objects. I need my projectile object and I need my controller object. So my projectile, I'm going to make my arrow, and my controller, I'm going to make my cube. All right, let's see if that works. Whoa, as you can see, my cube, I'm moving my mouse just a little bit. It's very sensitive and it went back to the 0 position. Right? So let's stop this. I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to take my cube. Let's make my cube a little bigger so we can see it better. I'm going to scale it up. You know what? My arrow was kind of pretty big, so I'm going to scale this down. Let's just try by 0.5. All right, then we're going to go back to our code. And the problem is I made this 0, but really what I want to do is I want to create this at -50. So my deltas, I don't want to add anything to the 0, but if it's too small or too big, I want to make this -50 in the z direction. All right, and it was very, very sensitive. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just taking the difference here, is I am going to take the amount they moved and I'm going to divide it by 10. We can do it just right in the parameters. I can do as much as I want here. If it's something simple, a lot of times I'll put it right in the parameter passing. I'll modify the value. If it's something complicated, I'll do it outside, and I could have taken this amount and divided it by 10. That's another option. It's just a lot easier to do it in here. And I am going to build this. All right, go back here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in here a little bit bigger. I'm going to run. It's kind of odd when you're doing mouse because the mouse also interacts with the UI. You can see my arrow moves and you can see my cube is moving and it won't go off the edges, so that's perfect. It's exactly what I want. Now this cube is 2 by 2 by 2, and I know that because I can actually see it. If I go up above, remember these little squares, each is 1 by 1, which is handy. So you can see it's 2 units wide, so it's 2 units tall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the cube up so it's sitting on top of the plane, so it's not kind of embedded in the plane there. And what I'm going to do is every time I click the mouse button, I want to launch an arrow. So what I'm going to do is go back to my code. I am going to create this at 1. So we'll move up 1. And remember, I got to change these to all 1. And that's another thing that we may want to do is, you'll notice I had to change this in 3 spots. We really don't want to, if we use the same number that is made multiple times, we don't want to put numbers in our code. Some coders call them magic numbers. It's basically a number, and if I change one, I may forget to change other places. So what I can do is I can make a const float, and we'll just call it y height position. What I do for constants, and again, some people do things differently, is I do them in all caps with underscores. In between, so we know that this is a constant. So it's basically just a number that's never going to change, and we need to set it to something, and we're going to make it equal to 1. Now what we can do is we can use that in every place that I want. And then if we decide to maybe make my controller bigger, I can just change this constant and it will change in all those spots. That's a handy thing to do. So again, where am I going to get this data from? In this case, the data of the Y position is going to come from a constant. My game objects are coming from a setting in the UI, and some of these others are just fixed numbers in the code itself. So now what I want to do is I want to, if the user clicks the left mouse button, I want to launch one of my arrows. So I'm going to come down here in the update and I say if input dot mouse button down 0. So they start counting at 0. There's really no way to know in a lot of these cases whether the first item is 0 or the first item is 1. A lot of times it is 0. Again, a little trial and error sometimes is needed because there's not really a way to know. In this case, the left mouse button is button 0. So if basically they click the mouse button down, I want to do something. And what I want to do is I want to instantiate, right? Just like we did in tutorial number 3. Instantiate. What I want to do is I want to instantiate my projectile object. I will copy this. I'm going to paste it here. But where there's the position. I want to give the position the same position as my controller object, right? It's going to start wherever my controller object is. But actually, it's red. Oh, yep. We'll see. I think that may be a problem, but we'll see how it goes. Quaternion dot identity. Let's see how this works. The problem is before I was moving my arrow on every update, but here I'm creating multiple arrows, right? So now there's nobody to move my arrow, and I really don't need to move my arrow. I can actually give my arrow a velocity. But in order to do that, I got to do a couple things. I have to go to my arrow. I'm just going to move this game guy, oops, back here. Just to get him out of the way because we're not really using him. I need to add something to my arrow, and I need to add a rigid body. So everything we've been doing right now is being run through the mesh render engine. There's actually a physics engine, and the physics engine is what's going to help me operate on a body to apply physical physical components and operate on those components like mass, gravity, collisions, momentum, all that other kind of good physics stuff. And a rigid body is one of those items that I need. And you'll notice it gives me a mass. It has friction, which is the drag. And in this case, I don't want to use gravity. If I use gravity, I would have to do some other things, which I'm not going to go into right now. So I'm just going to click that off. But now that I have a rigid body, I can operate on that rigid body in my code. Anything you see over in this inspector, I can access and change through code. And so I'll show you how to do that. So this is called rigid body. And if you look at that text string is what I'm going to want to access in my code. So let's go to my code. What I'm going to want to do is I want to get a game object. Let's call it projectile. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to access the rigid body of my game object. So I can type, there's a couple different ways of doing this. I'll just do it this way for now. And I'm going to want to make it the rigid body of my projectile that I just made. And I do this through get component, and I use angle brackets because it needs to know the component type. Again, it could be any of the components. In this case, the component type is rigid body. Remember, it's the same text that you saw in your inspector. And I use brackets because it's actually a function. And now I have the rigid body. So now I can type, and again, there's shortcut ways of doing this, but I'm just going to do it this way from now. And now I can change, I can access any of these, or I can change any of them. And what I want to do is I want to get its velocity. Again, there's other ways of doing this. I want to make the velocity equal. Again, it needs a vector 3. And I want it to have a set, let's give it a set speed. So I want to change it just in the z direction. But I want the velocity to go 0, 0. So it's not moving in the xy direction at all, just the z direction. And remember, before we had our time dot delta time, we're going to multiply it by, let's make it 15. Let's make them move a little faster. 15 meters a second. So it's going to set the velocity, and the z velocity is going to be, actually I don't need the delta time. That was when we were moving it ourselves. I really just need it to be 15. And I believe this is meters per second, but I really don't know what the value is. All right, so when they click the mouse button, I'm going to create a new projectile. I'm going to access its rigid body, and I'm going to give it a velocity. All right, so let's see how that works. All right, so let's try this out. Let's play. You can see it switched to our game view. So we can see we're moving our cube back and forth. And now when I click, it is launching our projectiles exactly how we want it to. And I can click as many as I want. Now you'll notice that all my arrows, now they don't destroy themselves when they hit the edge there anymore. I'm not sure if I can switch to the scene. Nope. See, as soon as I switch to the scene, since I'm interacting with the mouse, it makes it a bit more difficult to interact with the scene as I'm doing that, because they kind of conflict with each other. You can see our arrows way off in the distance, so we're going to have to take care of that. So what we need is we need the arrow to take care of itself. So what we need to do is make one more script. Let's make a create, and we'll call it, so really it could be assigned to any projectile. It's really not specific to an arrow, because if we replace the arrow with something else, which we'll do in the future, the same script can handle that too. So what we're going to call it projectile handler. All right. I'm going to double click on this. And what we want to do is we don't need to do anything on the start. In fact, we can just get rid of this because I'm not going to do anything special. But every time it's updated, what it wants to do is check its position. And if its position is greater than 50, we want to basically destroy ourselves. So we say if transform, remember, transform, if you just type transform, it gets the transform of yourself, whatever game object you're attached to, which is the projectile. And I'm going to give it the position dot z is greater than 50. So if we have moved 50, what I want to do is I want to destroy. So I want to destroy game object. The reason is transform automatically is the transform of the game object we're attached to. The game object variable is actually the game object which we're attached to. It's kind of weird when you think about it, and I'm not sure exactly how Unity sets it up. But if you're in a script that's attached to a game object, just typing game object will be yourself. So now if it's greater than 50, it should destroy whatever object it's attached to. So I'm going to build this. I'm going to go back to Unity. And now I need to attach this to our arrow, which was what we're using for our projectile. So let's select arrow. We're going to add component, and it's going to be a script, and it's going to be our projectile handler. And that should be set. So let's go. All right. Let's fire a bunch of arrows. And you can see as they hit that edge, they are now disappearing. All right. So we have successfully added mouse input and moved an object around, and we have created our objects, given them velocity, introduced the rigid body, which is the physics engine component. As we move forward, we'll be investigating more on the physics engine. The next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a bit on collision detection and introduce some gravity and colliders and some of the other things as objects start to interact with each other. So thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned as we move forward. Thanks, and if you like this video, remember, give it a thumbs up if it was helpful. Subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be adding a lot more tutorials going forward.